We're in Venice with Patrik Schumacher, who I met yesterday outside the Arsenale, and he very kindly agreed to do an interview immediately. So I really appreciate your kindness and your generosity with your time. Patrik needs no introduction. However, one must start by saying that Patrik is a known and necessary provocateur within the discourse, within academia, and definitely within practice. So the infiltration that Patrik has within the world of architecture is not limited. However, it might be called Marmite. People will either love it or hate it. I don't think people have a lukewarm approach to Patrik. So Patrik, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate your time. So the first question would be, what do you consider was your first project?
Well, I think some of my student work is some work which I still appreciate. So there are a number of, I started actually with the high tech and the use of industrial components to generate, generic industrial components to generate architectural compositions in Stuttgart University. Then as a student I moved to London and I did some projects there, engaging for the first time mixing philosophy with architecture at the Southbank University under the direction of Kevin Robotham, who's still a friend. And I did two interesting projects there, backed up with theoretical essays, one on engaging with anti-psychiatry, and the other one engaging with matters of education and educational discourse. So. But the real projects, I think the real first project was Vitra Fire Station. And that came very soon after I joined Zaha. I was still a student. A few months in, I had previously to Vitra, we've done a number of competition entries I was involved in. But Vitra was the one which I was sweating and working and trying to resolve, a very difficult project. In fact, you might be surprised to hear this, but if you have a garage and a series of very small additional spaces, and to create a piece of manifesto architecture out of this was a struggle, but I think we found something, we developed something which also had an urban ambition in terms of framing a linear space there. So that was my first project, and it turned out to be also Zaha's first build project she loved to show. And it took a while, it took much longer than a little project like this should have taken, but I'm still happy and proud of it.
It's interesting that you actually bring up two key terms when it comes to both philosophy and manifesto. So obviously this is an interest that has started early on within your career, right off the bat.
Yes, I mean, I studied philosophy before I moved into architecture. But when I then started architecture, there was initially no connection. Certainly not within Stuttgart University and the kind of approaches which were offered there. When I moved to London, I realized that, well, actually philosophy had entered the discourse there. This was in 1987, reading Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus for the first time, and we went through many rounds of reading and rereading it through the early 90s as well. But it was clear that philosophy mattered, and that my philosophical education and literary education could matter here. So we discussed architectural theory, Tafuri, figures like this, and the influence of Michel Foucault. I went to the AA to go to the lectures of Mark Cousins on Adorno, on Foucault, on Derrida. That was the beginning also that year when the Deconstructivism show opened in MoMA and Deconstructivism was launched, and I was right there right after, at that same year I joined Zaha's office. So philosophy and architecture seemed to be united and feeding off each other, even in the sense that philosophy was feeding off architectural discourse through the collaborations of Eisenman and Derrida, Foucault and Derrida. And in Foucault you can also see already that his notion of discursive formation included architectural systems and buildings as actors in an episteme, in an intellectual enterprise, which was always a social enterprise, as a science and discourse and ideology as social enterprises, and that they're also, like all societal processes, are building on being stabilized and structured by the built environment. So that became a very strong flourishing of and fusion of architecture and philosophy, and I never left that domain, but it took a while to discover that connection.
But then if we go back and talk about maybe autopoiesis of
Sure.
architecture. So you talk about the influence of philosophy and architecture on each other, but then how do we describe your book? And how do you describe it as a manifesto or a philosophy or an approach to architecture? And where does it fit in within that dynamic?
Well, this is an evolved, mature architectural theory, which I developed over the years. It took me 15 years to write it, and it cumulatively builds up from a series of essays. I've started to develop my readings of the grand social theory of Niklas Luhmann and the necessity I feel of embedding architectural theory in a theory of society. So this was Deleuze-Guattari, Derrida. These engagements were inspirational. They were stirring on the reflective process within the architectural theory, but there wasn't a direct embedding, a direct translation. It was more a perturbation stirring. Whereas later on, and with the autopoiesis of architecture, the ambition here is to develop a mature grand theory of architecture embedded in, again, a grand theory of social process and society, Luhmann's theory of function differentiated society and the way architecture as a discipline fits within that. It's also a discourse analysis of the discipline, the way it builds up its categories and theories historically and its methodologies. And then in volume 2 to see how this could be projected forward and how we can upgrade and remake and enhance the discourse of architecture in light of the new societal developments and new technologies of realizing new ambitions. So that is still underpinned by a philosophical framing, but it is much more. It is an elaborate, detailed through theory of architecture, which is also embedded in a theory of society, which in itself is more than just a philosophy. Philosophers are the provocateurs, the speculative creators of concept and conceptual opportunities, but then a lot of the work of developing a theoretical edifice based on these reminders, provocations, creative anticipations, it still needs to be done, and that is what I've done in this work.
If we compare it, like for example, Korb gives 5 points and it gives you 2 volumes and an aggressive 15 years of study.
I mean, I've compared this piece of architectural theory, I call it the self-descriptions of architecture, the great self-descriptions. There have been a series of grand theoretical offerings across the centuries. Architecture starts for me with the Renaissance, with Alberti in fact, with his 10 books of architecture. And then you have, in the 18th century, you have Loger and you have Boulet, but then you have Semper as well. And in particular, in the 19th century, you have Durand, is a systematic approach to architecture. And these grand self-descriptions start always with the conception of the good society, of the contemporary institutions of that time and how architecture can manifest them and articulate them. It goes through the resources of the designer, including the media of design. I mean, these are comprehensive accounts, treatises of what architecture's purposes are, what its means are, and what its values should be relative to its purposes. And so Corbusier delivered one of those. and they needed to be redelivered because the tasks and conditions within which architecture had to operate had evolved through various stages and socioeconomic epochs. So for Le Corbusier, it was to reinvent and re-establish architecture congenial to the industrial society and the democratic mass society based on an industrial paradigm. And I think that's what Towards a New Architecture and The City of Tomorrow, these two books, deliver. But society has moved on. We're no longer living in that era of what I now in retrospect call the post-Fordist era, the Fordist era of mechanical mass production, the industrial society Le Corbusier addressed. We're now living in a post-Fordist network society. Much more complexity and dynamism, self-directedness, and new means. So it's a technology-based, new technologies coming in, particular computation and telecommunication, which changed everything for the city, for architecture, both with its purposes and means. And so we needed to rewrite the manifesto or the big treaties. And that's what I'm trying to do. And in my book at the end of volume 2, I'm actually making that comparison. I'm lining up Alberti, Durand, Le Corbusier, and then my book with a grid of features which all these grand self-descriptions of architecture include, and to see where we are, where we have evolved, and what the rationality of each of these treatises is. And look, my book had to be larger because we're living in a much more complex world, where there's more things to discuss, to account for. There's a natural progression in size of these treatises. It's not that, you know, I've tried to edit it down. I've had lots of pressure to not allow it to inflate further and to edit and cut. So it's as kind of parsimonious as it gets, but it still went across 1,000 pages, 1,200 pages.
How would you react? I mean, this is a well-known fact that a lot of people view your approach to architecture as a very aggressive one, and an aggressive manifesto or a launch in a very biased manner. However, do you consider that problematic, or do you encourage other people to be just as...
Well, look, I don't call it aggressive. I mean, I'm critical of backward tendencies, of retro tendencies. They're never meant to be ad hominem. I just want to be frank about what should not be respectable positions. And I think my plea is to shift the discursive culture, to have less kind of laissez-faire, anything goes in discursive terms where everybody is happy and self-indulgent in what they think is the right and a good kind of approach, and we should leave each other alone and respect each other's predilections. If you think about it like this, then it's not really discourse. Then it's I believe we should vet each other's work, we should critique each other, we should take each other to task, to find a path, to converge towards a viable and productive path for the discipline. So I'm trying to offer leadership to the discipline, but also offering my propositions to criticism. It takes on a little bit of aggressive note sometimes, but it's never meant ad hominem. It's never meant to undermine people. It meant to undermine bad ideas, and so that's where I'm going, and I'm happy to receive criticism. So I have grown a thick skin in this, but what drives me is not is kind of self-promotion, and I'm promoting a lot of my younger colleagues through inviting them to publish, to presenting their works, through offering collaboration as well. So it's not an ego trip, it's a movement I'm hoping to build, and we had this movement going, and the movement was growing. It got a bit defrayed in recent years through the financial crisis, through the lack of nerve in the discipline, this idea of back to basics, of austerity, this idea of seeing some of these experiments we had been going with as self-indulgent and exuberant. I think they weren't, and we have matured a lot within the movement of parametricism, which also moved through various stages. So I think this deserves to be debated, and my task has been to see to go beyond the fascination with technology and the technological superiority of and sophistication of these new architectures. They're congenial with all the engineering advances, but to see and show the societal depth, the sociological depths, the purposes and rationales and requirements of having a more complex, dynamic and legible built environment. So social functionality needs to be more emphasis, and that was Parametrism 2.0. And that's a tough one. You have to have a double intelligence. You need to have that technical, computational intelligence. You need actually the virtuoso talent to handle complex forms and geometries, and you need to develop that sociological understanding, programmatic intuitions, and that's a kind of double or triple coincidence of discursive up-to-dateness and intelligence, which is rare. So there must be also division of labor between various characters in a discourse who trust each other and build this movement. That's what I'm pleading for, that's what I'm trying to establish, and that's why I'm also going around now and trying to mentor young intellectuals and support them, and I'm having a PhD program as well, etc., to build that movement, which is a tough one. It's a very advanced frontier to engage with, and you can't just do it, shake it out of your, shoot from the hip and think you can add to this. It's a cumulative research project which needs a different cast of character. It needs patience, needs hard work, needs painstaking theorizing and research. That's the spirit. And the great example for me is Frei Otto and his research institute. But now then backing that up with a, let's say, sociological understanding.
You're very comfortable jumping from discussing tools, techniques, and architectural precedent, but then also social constructs.
Yeah.
Where do you see the architect's role? Because you're comfortable discussing all of these points, whereas there's a lot of architects that we could argue that are not comfortable leaving the realm of design or form or precedent, and you seem comfortable to jump back and forth between them.
And that's necessary, and I think you always found in the various great movements of architecture that there's a theorists or theoreticians and practitioners, more intuitive avant-garde talent, and more figures who are more able to rationalize and execute and expand. You see that in the modern movement, you see that also in recent movements like what I'm very familiar with, for instance, if you look at the deconstructivist movement, where you had thinkers and theorists and writers like Peter Eisenman, Bernard Tschumi, who also did work, as well as Rem Koolhaas, and then you have more intuitive geniuses, say, like Zaha and Frank Gehry and Kurt Himmelblau or Wolf Briggs. So in the same as in our movement, you have various figures who are more technically intelligent, figures who are intuitive in their talent, figures who are thinking and theorists. You also have pure theorists adding in. So the deconstructivism, you had Mark Wigley and others. In modernism, you also had Siegfried Gideon, who wasn't a designer, contributing, as well as and others like Adolf Behne. And also in our movement, you have figures, whether it's Frédéric Miguerou or Mario Capo and many others, Benjamin Bratton, who are accompanying that contemporary discourse with theoretical insights. But some figures also need to integrate that in their person, in their thinking, that these things come together. But I think the movement is one with multiple talents that at least intuitively understand each other's relevance, and then forge a movement which really can impact and make the difference. And I think modernism showed that this can be done, and parametricism hasn't demonstrated that because it's not strong enough yet. It's not pervasive enough yet. Although there is encouragement, and I'm even encouraged if some of the commercial firms pick up and take up some of these new repertoires and discover that they can deliver better products. If you look at recent airport designs, not only our airport in Beijing airport, but also Mumbai airport by SOM or Fuchs's Shenzhen airport, there are strong propositions in the style and methodology of pragmatism. So that's encouraging. So I think, but we need the breakthrough, and for that I need to actually ramp up my rhetoric and become a little bit more aggressive.
And maybe to wrap up and let Patrik get to his busy schedule at the Biennale, where do you see architecture heading right now, as a quick final comment question?
Well, if you look at the Biennale, it's kind of tragic in many ways that we're not progressing, and we're not even discussing the various tendencies and trends of architecture much. If you look at the national pavilions, they're all empty. Curators taking over with slogans which are generic, societal problems, issues, not architecture related, no architecture on show, no projects on show. Architects asked to maybe do installations for particular themes they've never thought of, except when they were asked to by the curators. It's a real tragedy. It's nothing going on. It's a waste. And although I think the National Pavilion, where the two curators from Graft did actually some curation and asked some architects to show work. Zumthor's work is actually quite interesting. It's not super progressive, it's not the frontier, but it's a joy to look at, and he is expanding his repertoire, so that may be the highlight for me so far. And a few other rooms with architects, projects, some historical projects. A lot of the only works really one sees is mostly historical works from the 60s, maybe. There's a lot of that rehashing and re-looking at, fair enough, but we should look at contemporary work. I've yet to see the Arsenal, though. I'm going over there now. What we're seeing here at the Biennale is indicative of the lack of nerve, the lack of conviction, the lack of optimism that architecture, progressive and new architecture, could challenge and change and enhance world society. That's what I find. We're going in too many directions. There's neo-postmodernism, there's neo-rationalism, neo-modernism, neo-historicism. Then there's a lot of kind of simple pragmatism which denies any tendency and ideological thrust. And that means no manifesto character to the work, just local, addressing local issues one by one. It's sad. Of course, the movement of pragmatism is still alive. It was matured. Maybe didn't get enough of the new, young kind of followingship it needs to refresh itself and to move forward. But those who had understood and discovered its potentials kept together and kept moving and kept maturing. So there's hope that this movement will break through. That's the only hope I have. We keep working at it. But the current state of architecture is sad, indeed. It's really a retro scene.
Well, Patrik, everyone's always excited to hear what you have to say, and it's great to know that you have more speaking engagements coming up and carrying on in the Biennale as well. It was a pleasure to sit down with you today. A great honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.